author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. And today we're talking security, financial, food, and national. It's going to be quite the show. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. One of the most significant factors impacting American security these days is that of the food situation. How is it going? Why does it seem that most foods are being classified as poisonous to some degree? We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more on this topic. We're very fortunate to be joined by farmer, lawyer, statesman, some might say, national correspondent of LibertyNation.com, Mr. John Clark. How are you, sir?
I'm very well and blessed to be here. Thanks for having me, Mark.
So, John, food safety and food security and even food usefulness is really coming to the fore. Part of this is due to Robert F. Kennedy's pushing of Make America Healthy Again. That's very much the zeitgeist of it. But the concerns over food security and food safety have been growing for quite a while. Why do you think they're coming to a head right now?
Well, I think several changes in our food system are coming to a head, and particularly here in the U.S. There are a lot of things that we eat that are not permitted in your foods in Europe and other parts of the world. But the biggest transition for all of human agriculture has been GMO technology and the monocultures that now supply the bulk of our food and our livestock's feed. They are dependent on glyphosate and other chemical applications, and more evidence is coming out that maybe this is not good for the soil, not good for human health, and there's a reason why something like 98% of American women have glyphosate or Roundup in their breast milk. Maybe it's not good and should be studied more. And so there's a huge controversy about glyphosate itself. There have been thousands of lawsuits claiming that it causes Hodgkin's lymphoma, but it's only one of many chemicals, and I think more Americans are becoming aware that their food is saturated with unnatural, human-made chemicals, often designed to also then in processing, also designed to stimulate our taste buds or to cover up bad flavors or to make us keep
or
eating
no flavors,
don't want to.
In fact.
Or yeah, I mean, and right. And so actually there's a whole book by a guy named Michael Moss called Hooked, which is really creepy. It's like a Frankenstein book. They're out there right now trying to create more chemicals to make us eat stuff. But another big thing, in answer to your question, is recent revelations about two things. One is all of the chemicals also in our packaging. We've been told for 100 years that those Teflon frying pans were just fine. And now we've identified over 12,000 chemicals that are forever chemicals that build up in our bodies and that are in our packaging. Everything from saran wrap to the snackables to every dimension of our food. So now we have an extra source of contamination. And in the midst of that, we have this sort of, wow, I could have had a V8 realization that so much human illness is linked to the human gut. And guess what? All of these chemicals kill the microbiome of the human gut. And here we are. And so I think the convergence of all three of those things is actually creating a very real crisis. It's actually a dawning awareness that, whoops, we've made some mistakes in pursuit of cheap, fast food. And how do we slow it down and heal ourselves from this sort of self-immolation? I think that's why you're going to continue to see the zeitgeist shift.
So that's a fascinating little recent history thing that you've covered there, John. And it seems to me that for the entirety of human history, there's been almost a natural flourishing of people with their food environments, and it's been a very symbiotic relationship. So people have used the land for farming or for hunter-gathering, depending on where they are. And it's been, by necessity, it's been a beneficial relationship to each side, because if one side goes astray, usually the human side, then that area of food production or health-giving production dissipates or gets destroyed. And yet, I guess since food stopped being what we might term food, that there's a lot more processing involved to make food or food-related substances, what's happened is that's actually been detrimental to the the environmental factors that allow food conversion products like grass, for example, proper grasses to feed cows, to be ruined or deteriorated. And I'm wondering, is this, and without getting too apocalyptic, it seems to me that the type of farming now that the more environmental people talk about, the people who are very focused on the environmental stuff, even those on the far fringes, um, they seem to be quite destructive to the land. Whereas if we got back to, and I know you're a big proponent of this, like regenerative farming, we wouldn't actually be at the tipping point where we are now. Have I made any sense there?
You've made a lot of sense, and you liked my last comment, and I made it up in response to your question. If you ask the right questions, you make my cogs come together, and you've done it again. So let me see if I can address that. Yes, ultimately, I don't make the rules. We don't make the rules. The Green Revolution and the modern ability to grow a lot of food in a small space really is a form of miracle. The problem is, like many things with technologies, we found out it had long-term impacts that ultimately may lead to desertification, the destruction of soil. And this, through that agricultural history, is what many ancient cultures have done. They have destroyed their soils by not stewarding them well. We are not new to that game. What we are new to, and to use your launching point, is that humans for tens of thousands of years employed horses and cows, or oxen mostly, and ourselves as labor in agriculture, human labor. We might have had a grist mill with a little hydro here and there, but mostly it was human labor. And then all of a sudden the combustion engine comes along, and there's a long history of fertilizers, everything from human fertilizer, which was prized in China,
Like soil.
yes, literally you would, when visiting friends, you would deposit something for them at the end of the night, so that they could, Gene Lodgson has written a book about
A
this.
tradition I'm sure many of us carry on to this day.
Well, actually, I know people who do. It's called composting, and it's legal, and and because it works, because the bacteria actually get killed by that bacterial action. But so then we had a whole guano industry, which led to wars and seizures of properties, and then that kind of failed, and we've got this synthetic fertilizer. So in a very short period of time, historically, humans went from cow, horse, and our backs to fossil fuels, which provide enormous amounts of energy, but they're limited in supply, and they are directly linked to a fiat currency. See, it used to be I could sell you some milk and trade you for a little chunk of gold I could bite on. And we have something called a fiat currency. So we've now intruded between ourselves and our food a dependency on fossil fuels, many of them from abroad, and that are then denominated in a dollar, which is susceptible to inflation. And then we have all the other technological dependencies in addition to the energy. And what you're talking about is an effort at the industrial scale to shift towards what are called regenerative practices, no-till agriculture. I think that's what you're referring to. And many of these processes are highly productive, but highly destructive. And so they require more and more applications of chemicals every year to get your same yield. More atrazine, which is an endocrine disruptor and mimics estrogen, maybe not good in our bodies. I'm pretty sure it's banned in Europe, is still in use in America because it increases our corn crop by about 4% a year. How much are we going to put profits above human health? We have about 92 million acres put to corn last year. The ethanol market, it's all a boondoggle. It's all polluting more than it's protecting. It's not ultimately actually efficient enough to spare us energy. We have bad policies created by corporations that are very profitable for them, very unhealthy for the rest of us. Hydrogenated fat, high fructose corn syrup. These are waste products that they've found a way to process into something that we're supposed to feed our children. And you may have been watching the litigation and efforts to improve legislation in America so that we don't have heavy metals like cadmium and lead and mercury in our baby food, in our beech nut baby food. So can we really trust our food companies any more than tobacco companies, which once upon a time lied to us? So a lot of this effort that I think you referred to by industrial food producers is to try to put on a patina or a facade of regenerativeness. But if you're reducing the amount of times you till, but you're still soaking the ground with chemicals in order to get your yield, you've only come part of the way. And these chemicals kill the microbes in the soil, increase erosion, increase water loss. The whole thing is actually a slow motion catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. And industrial agriculture has a long way to go before it can do more good than harm in its production.
If only there were a four-legged, four-stomach solution to this whole problem. We'll be back with John Clark after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's national correspondent, who also happens to be a farmer, lawyer, and pastor, Mr. John Clark. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about how the food production models have really become an industry, and how that's, well, let's be fair, it's quite detrimental to soil longevity and overall general health. When you get ultra-processed foods, things tend to suffer. But now I want to approach the food issue from a security perspective, if we may, John, and talk about how America is getting its food now. Because it seems, and I might be wrong on this, that there's a reliance on imports over growth, which is strange considering how much land there is in the United States. What's your take?
Well, with the 30/30 project, I think it's called, they're setting aside more and more of our farmland, supposedly to protect the ecosystem, which makes absolutely no sense when well-managed farmland sequesters more carbon than forests ever will. This is a fact. And so industrial systems are used to disparage and close down local rural systems. This is what's happening in Europe as well. And you raise the issue of getting food from further or further away and security threats. I'll use another historical analogy. Here in Vermont, where I live and my family have been for many generations, there's a history of agriculture. The agricultural industry here peaked in 1852 with the price of wool hitting $1 a pound for merino wool. And if you had $9 a sheep, I got 60 of them now, that would be a lot of money in 1852. You could drive around Vermont, you could see some of the finest big brick houses. They have the date right on them, 1850, 1852. The market collapsed. So Vermont shifted to producing cheese and butter that it could sell to Boston. Couldn't sell milk because milk would perish, right? You had to take it by horseback or wagon. We moved tens of thousands of turkeys, hundreds of thousands of turkeys, walked them to Boston.
Turkey drives, yeah.
Right. It was amazing. Actually, they'd stop at night. You didn't want them on your barn. It would collapse, right? All these turkeys. So this is a tradition we've forgotten about. But then as transportation improved, Vermonters started selling fresh milk to Boston. And that became our dairy industry to replace our wool dependency. Wool shipped very well. It keeps better than milk. Well, guess what? By the 1890s, the railroads started opening up to Ohio and other places that have milder climates, flatter ground, fewer rocks, and they can make milk too. Vermont wasn't very competitive there. So our dairy industry has been struggling ever since. Now let's expand this to a national situation where modern technologies allow us to ship food further and further away, not just because of quick transport on trains, but because now we've harvested it earlier, we've sprayed it with some stuff to inhibit its hormones and keep it from rotting and kill the fungus. We can extend its shelf life. We can ship it from further or further away. With globalization, with NAFTA, with other things, we have created a really wonderful bounty. I mean, I can get avocados from all over the world and in Mexico that I could never have gotten here just 20, 30 years ago. Bananas year round. I mean, we really do benefit from the wonders of this, but it is precarious and it conceals multiple levels of threat that are actually unprecedented and invisible, perhaps until they pop. So why we're getting our food further and further away also from China, where it's, aside from issues of competitiveness, aside from issues of the economy and even land use, there is a vulnerability that the more we expand this in the name of profit, the more we have risks and dependencies that we're not really countering or considering, kind of like those hidden chemicals in our food supply that for years we thought, oh, well, if you can't see it, it can't hurt you. And that's why Wendell Berry has written and called globalization the greatest weapon of mass destruction ever developed by man, in part because it dissolves these cultures that are dependent, everything from Mexican maize to, all around the world, traditional peasant or other farming cultures, and here in the US, even the Vermont dairy culture, have all been the victims, by the way, of a system that highly subsidizes monocultures. Billions and billions of dollars every year go to the industrial agricultural system. This is not a free market. We could compete a lot better as organic or grass-fed farmers if the other side wasn't having the scales tip so heavily in their favor. So the more we expand internationally, if you imagine the Great Depression, my family did pretty well here in Vermont because they still had a lot of local food supply. They were subsistence farmers. Everybody had a pig or a cow. I don't know what you do in the large cities if you looked at 1929 and looked at today, if something like that happened, because our entire agricultural system is unrecognizably changed and divorced from that more local, thriving and nurturing system. And we don't reclaim it overnight when we've put everything to suburbia and asphalt.
So there's actually, as you point out, there's almost like a series of potential pitfalls, and any one of them could trigger a large food problem in the United States, the richest country in the world, could trigger a large food problem, a famine in the United States. And that's all these different potential triggers. And they're not by themselves, individually, that unlikely to happen. So let's take one example. Let's do soybeans from China. Now, I believe that soybean oil is the most consumed oil in the United States. Not necessarily, you pour your canola stuff, but within the foods, which is the largest source of fat oils for most people. But those soybeans, they come from China, right? And so if China decides in an adversarial form, we're not going to ship, or we're going to hike the price to take advantage of your depression. If you're in like a recession, sorry, not depression, if there's a recessive economy in the UK and in the US, and they might try and hike this because it's an adversarial force. And then all of a sudden, the highly processed foods that rely on these soybean oils to give them flavor, to give them substance, they won't be able to produce. And that means that a large chunk of American food, I'm going to use the air quotes for that, food, is taken out of the equation, which means that Americans then have to rely on the homegrown food. And that's being squeezed out in favor of the multinationals. And these, as you say, these globalist enterprises that can ship containers of beans or different things across the globe, really, because of all the new time unconstraints that they have. And I guess I just want to finish up. So my question is, John, without getting too hyperbolic as I want to do, how close are we to a disaster like this?
I don't know. It looks like Russia's onto it. Since Crimea Spring, Putin has really improved Russia's agricultural system. But you've mentioned just soybeans, and we also do produce soybeans, and those vary, and maybe we're better off not eating them. But what about diesel exhaust fluid, without which we can't move our trucks? What about our container ship system? We have a lot of things we're dependent on China for, more than just soybeans. So there are multiple. What about an electromagnetic pulse? What would that do to the supplies to your local grocery store in America? So there are actually, as you say, multiple facets of risks, of which foreign production is merely one. Foreign distribution and getting it here may be the bigger problem. And China controls a lot of microchips for our tractors and the diesel exhaust fluid upon which our trucks run, which is made from urea. They held back fertilizer exports when they didn't have enough of their own food a few years ago. They could do it again.
John Kwa, thank you ever so much for being with us. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As the great sci-fi novelist once wrote about Forever Wars, it seems that these things just continue through infinity. Now, we've seen in the last couple of years two new wars that, while the United States is not directly involved in them, is certainly acting as though it has skin in that particular game. Now, we're going to talk about those today, the new Forever Wars, with somebody who knows everything there is to know about national security and has great insight into motivations in this field. And that's Dave Patterson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, let's talk about these two new, what seem to be Forever Wars. Because when we talk about Forever Wars, we think that the 20-year wars with Afghanistan. But what's happening now really does have the possibility to turn to something that lasted even longer than that. And although the United States isn't boots on the ground, as it were, the United States is involved. We look at Ukraine and you have Joe Biden talking about a 10-year security agreement. Well, surely that if that's the only negotiation towards an ending of the war is a 10-year security agreement, doesn't that mean that it's almost certainly going to last at least 10 years? And aren't we just laying the groundwork for a permanent state of war in quite an Orwellian fashion, I might add? What's your take?
Well, actually, I think that's right. And it all stems from the fact that when you start a when you start a war or you start to engage in supporting hostilities, it would be a good idea if you had an end state in mind. What does winning look like? This has been the significant failure of the Biden administration in every single geopolitical engagement that they have engaged in. It is the single biggest flaw in their thinking. If you do not have some idea of what you want to see at the end and you start working toward that, I mean, it's just common sense. When you start an assembly line, you would really like to know what's going to come off the other end. Will it be a car, a toaster, or a spatula? If you don't know what that is, how do you ever begin and how do you work the process to get there? And this is where we are with the Biden administration. They are clueless about what it is that they want to see at the end. And the longer they are procrastinating and fidgeting and worrying about escalation, the more obscure and vague the end state becomes. If they had dealt with this, now it's always great, hindsight is always great, but at the time people were saying these very things. You need to stop the Russians from building up their forces on the border of Ukraine. They did not. In fact, when you had the big summit in 2021, June of 2021, Biden talked with Putin, and when he came back, he stopped all of the lethal aid to Ukraine. Now, just a second. What kind of thought process did that? And what it ended up being is the opportunity for Putin to say, well, yeah, we get this. So he put 20,000 more people on the border. And then in November, when they finally figured out that being nice doesn't work, then they started back with the aid again. But by then, I mean, it was over. It was too late to do anything. And then you have what's going to be a forever vexing encounter with China and the Taiwan Straits. We don't do what is necessary to convince China that, you probably could attempt to invade, but it would be so disastrously costly to you that it would not be a good idea. So that you have one actual kinetic problem going on in Ukraine, you have a potential problem going on in the Straits of Taiwan, and the same feckless, we don't know what the end looks like, we have no strategy, approach is being used in both, and that guarantees a protracted challenge.
You see, I think you're absolutely right here, Dave. There doesn't seem to be any sort of end game at all for the biggest non-principal player. So it's clear what Ukraine wants. Ukraine wants its territory back from Russia, and I figure this will probably end up, if this ever ends in this forever war, there's an oxymoron there, I guess, is that they want as much of their territory back as possible and guarantees that no further incursions will take place into is it the Donbass region?
Yeah, the Donbass and Luhansk region,
yes.
Right.
Russia
and Crimea.
And Crimea, of course. Russia wants to finalize the keeping of Crimea, and it wants at least some sway over the contested areas, Donbass and Luhansk. And so their goals are clear. But then you have the international community that is very much involved in a war for the first time, really, that they're involved in a war without actually being involved in a war. And I think it's almost you've heard of Munchausen by proxy, where somebody
absolutely.
pretends to be
Exactly.
ill.
In fact, I've used that analogy, right?
Yes, yeah. So yes, they pretend that a close family member is ill, so they can then reap the benefits of being the martyr for the cause. Yes, you've used that analogy in your writing, absolutely. And it seems to me that that's what the US is doing. Well, not just the US, the entire international community. They're saying, we're going to fight this war. We're going to win this war. We can't let the forces of evil do what they want and trample democracy. No, we're not actually going to go there. No, we're not going to do that. No, it's going to be the taxpayers' generous donations that we keep funding so other people can die. And that strikes me as a very bad way to try and extricate from a war, which leads us again to the original question. There is no end in sight as long as the largest principal actor who isn't involved is determined to essentially milk the situation for as much political credit as they can without committing troops, which I don't think they should do, by the way. Just my personal, I don't think anybody outside of the main acts should commit troops, but they want to do as much as they can without committing troops so they can adopt the persona of a wartime leader. And so there's no benefit for the international community in this conflict finishing, or am I completely off base with that?
No, I think you're right. But to carry the Munchausen by proxy metaphor, it's worse because the perpetrator actually causes the illness in order to come in and provide the remedy. And this is what's happening because of the just feckless approach that the Biden administration has taken. First of all, I mean, it's almost one event per week throughout this entire, episode. First of all, Ukraine asks for MiG-29s to replace their MiG-29s that are being shot down. Poland says, we'll do that. Blinken says, good idea. I green light that proposal. Austin says, not so fast. We're not going to do that. It might escalate the war. Excuse me. The fact that you didn't do that escalated the war. Well, and tick them off. Patriots, ATACMS, M1A1 tanks. They procrastinate, saying, "Oh my gosh, it's going to escalate the war," and then they give in and provide what was needed. This is not the way you fight a war. And if you have any intention of coming out with even close to what you had hoped for, if you had something to hope for, this is not the way. This portrays the West as indecisive, cowardly, and with an inability to understand what's going on. And it opens the door for China, who comes in and says, why don't you let us help you negotiate, just like they're doing in the Middle East. And when they come in, you're cut out, West. And so it just substantiates everything that our enemies and those who would be enemies think about the West.
Dave, it seems that you're right, that this is certainly not the way to prosecute a war that you hope to win, but it is almost a way to guarantee that the forever war dollars will keep flowing. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The U.S. national debt continues to expand. Is there an end in sight? And is there a solution on the horizon? We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. And, right away, you can just end this program. There is no solution. It's only going to get worse.
I disagree. And I'm going to blow your mind with my...
Okay, blow my mind.
I've read precisely. How many books have I read on economics? I haven't read any. However, I'm a thinking man, and I think a thinking creature can always come up with a solution to a problem. So, Andrew, let's get the facts of the US national debt out in the open first. What are we looking at? 35 trillion thereabouts by the end of this year?
Yeah. Well, no, end of this year, it's already at 35 trillion. End of the year, it's
so,
going to be 36 trillion at the end of the year.
So wait. How much are we adding? How much is the US adding over, let's say, 6 months?
It's about $1 trillion every 6 months. Yes.
$1 trillion every 6 months. So, okay, well that's
the U.S. government 200 years to get to its first trillion, and now it takes the U.S. government about 6 months to add $1 trillion.
Einstein said nothing quite as powerful as cumulative interest. I think you should have a look at the national debt spending. Although part of that is cumulative interest, I would argue.
Yes, you got to mention this. Yes.
So let's talk about that. So you've got an extra $1 trillion every 6 months. What does that work out at in terms of? Now here's what I love. It's what I hate actually, but you know the expression. How much does that work out per person in the United States? How much does each person in the United States owe because of the government spending?
It's at least $100,000, but per taxpayer, it's about $230,000.
I mean that's a worrying figure in itself, isn't it, Andrew?
Yes.
But I mean, sure, we don't expect 5-year-olds to be paying income tax on their lemonade stand, although
they will. The way the government is running right now, the way finances are, they will eventually tax lemonade stands.
So you've got this situation. So per taxpayer, $230,000 roughly is,
Yes.
and I hate to use the term, is owed by, but as far as the government's concerned, that taxpayer is earmarked for $230,000 of payments, right? As long as they live long enough, they're earmarked for $230,000 worth of payments, which of course won't go into paying off the debt. It would just go to pay for the next things. But, and this is going to sound like a terribly stupid question, Andrew, but the US dollar is the chief currency in the world, and the US seems to be able to print dollars whenever it wants.
You're going there. Garrett Bernstein territory here.
Come on, tell me why that situation is wrong. I do know that it's wrong, but tell me why.
Because that would result in hyperinflation. If the U.S. government were to just print its way and to print another $15 trillion to cover the remaining, just to cover domestic, because remember, you have two levels of debt. You have the debt owed by the American people, and then you have debt owed by foreigners. So let's say the debt owed by the people is around $28 trillion, and then about $8 trillion with foreigners. So if you just covered it, it's $27 trillion, you'd have hyperinflation. So the U.S. government just taps into the capital markets and borrows from investors in order to just maintain the current level of spending and interest payments, not to pay down the national debt or to cover future spending, to cover current spending now. So that's why the government doesn't just print its own money. Although you could make the case that the Federal Reserve already monetizes the national debt through the purchasing of Treasury securities.
That's actually what I was coming to. Yeah, you saw where I was going with that. So you have these funds being raised by these Treasury bonds. Now, isn't that just? It's almost like a canard, isn't it? It's something it's got to collapse in on itself.
Well, this is the problem that's going on right now. So, okay, there's a few things here. So right now, the Federal Reserve has been trimming its balance sheet, which a lot of it is comprised of Treasury debt securities. Yeah. It's been lowering this, so it lowered it in March 2022. It's about $7 trillion now, the balance sheet. It announced a couple of months ago that it would reduce the amount of tapering of Treasury securities from 60 billion to 25 billion. Their argument is that it allows them to trim their holdings without creating chaos in the financial markets. Now, here's the funny part of it is that this is creating a situation where it's stealth QE, because now they're lowering
QE being quantitative easing.
Yes, quantitative easing. Because the U.S. government can now sell more T-bills to the financial markets without creating higher yields, because now the Federal Reserve is holding on to more bonds. So that was the whole point of it. So a lot of people are accusing, including Republican senators, Janet Yellen, of manipulating the markets doing this.
It's a fascinating.
One more thing too.
Yeah.
Sorry. When you come to borrowing, the new Treasury borrowing funding estimates shows that the U.S. government is going to borrow about $1 trillion over the next 6 months, and it's going to focus primarily on short-term debt securities. What is interesting about this 6-month outlook is that the cash balance is about $700 billion. Investors are paying very close attention to this number because, so in a couple of months, guess what's going to happen? Debt ceiling negotiations yet again. And if this thing prolongs, then the Treasury will once again have to tap into the TGA, the Treasury General Account, and you're going to have all these things again. You're going to have, the credit downgrades again by Moody's. You're going to have, chaos in the Treasury markets. Maybe exacerbate current conditions in the equities arena. So that was a very underreported report from the Treasury.
Well, let's stick with what's going to be happening on Capitol Hill in terms of trying to keep the government lights on. There's nobody really proposing. Obviously, there's an election coming up just around the corner. I don't know if you heard about it. Some people think it's going to be important. I'm not so sure. But in terms of the national debt, is it going to be an important election? And if I may just put my admittedly uneducated position out there, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference who wins in terms of the national debt.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no disagreement with you there. You saw under Trump, he worsened the fiscal conditions. Kamala Harris has no issue whatsoever with spending more money. So the things, it doesn't matter who wins. Whoever wins, the national debt loses. And you see these spending programs from the current administration and the previous one. Nobody tackled whatsoever the national debt. And you mentioned earlier about cumulative payments. Right now, under the Congressional Budget Office's estimate, which is a rosy outlook, mind you, $13 trillion in cumulative interest payments over the next decade. Now, what happens if there's a recession, if there's, a war, if there's another pandemic that requires more government spending, more government taking on debt, so you could have potentially even higher interest payments, cumulative ones, over this decade outlook.
Andrew, final point, if I may. You have this situation where more and more of the, let's call it, I'm doing the inverted quotes, government money is going to be used to finance the debt that the government incurs. Doesn't that mean that at some point it's going to have to be services that are provided by the government that are cut back on?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just Social Security alone, once the reserve is exhausted and there's not enough money to cover the payments, there's automatically under legislation a 20% cut to benefits. But the issue with government spending is not so much the non-discretionary, it's the mandatory spending that accounts for at least 2/3 of all the outlays. So you can cut unimportant spending, but you still gonna have that giant black hole of the mandatory spending and the interest payments. You look at the 10-year outlook from the CBO, $7 trillion mandatory spending out of a $10 trillion or $10.4 trillion budget by 2034. That's unsustainable. But no one's willing to tackle that because it includes things like Social Security and Medicare.
It's the only time sustainability is mentioned in Washington, D.C., and people run for miles. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That is just about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to mention that Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. My thanks today to our special guests, National Correspondent John Klaw, Economist Andrew Moran, and National Security Correspondent Dave Patterson. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there who tune in to the show each and every week. I'd like to leave you with the words of Henry Ford, who said, "If money is your hope for independence, you'll never have it. The only real security that a man will have in this world is a reserve of knowledge, experience, and ability." So, no matter how dark times seem for the economy, food security, and even national security, I think Mr. Ford has a point. It is through the better recreation of ourselves, through gaining new knowledge, gaining new experiences, and testing our abilities, that we can better weather the storms of outside events. Wise words, I think. Thank you for listening.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.